Have you been to my side of the pond? You sound American. I'm guessing you're in the States. I'm in South Africa.
Yes, sir.
Have you been to my side?
No, I have not been to South Africa. No, I'm in the States.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Have you been to the African continent?
No, that's one of the few continents I have not been to. So I've been to Europe, Asia. I've been to Australia. I love Australia, New Zealand, but no, I haven't stopped over in Africa yet.
You must. There's a type of freedom that comes with the chaos it's unmatchable.
Certainly.
You said New Zealand and Australia. Now, I've also been to Australia. I don't think I had as a good a time as you. Why do you like it?
I mean, New Zealand is just New Zealand definitely more than Australia, right? But beautiful, beautiful country. And I'm a huge fan of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. And so, oh yeah, getting to go to Middle Earth and see all these, different sites. I mean, I have a rock from Rivendell, or, where they filmed Rivendell at. So, I mean, just being able to nerd out and, just annoy all the other people on on these trips, right? It was a great time. I love New Zealand. Beautiful, beautiful country.
They actually have a place called Hobbiton. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. So, after they had torn it down after the original Lord of the Rings movie, but when they remade it for The Hobbit. And so afterwards they kept it kind of as a permanent, fixture. And so, yeah, you can go over to Hobbiton. You can have a pint at the Green Dragon Inn. I mean, it's like right out of the movies,
Excepting that you don't see any orcs.
Yeah, no orcs, no creepy crawlies, right? But
what did you think of The Hobbit?
I mean, it is wretched movies. Yeah, I mean, geez, no, it's could have been easily 2 movies, right? I mean, padding it out for a third was, definitely a marketing thing, and yeah, no, I mean, where to even begin?
The actual Lord of the Rings director's cut trilogy, I thoroughly enjoyed. I try and watch that every year. It's just so good.
Oh yeah, it's. I mean, I've largely stopped watching movies, but Lord of the Rings is one of the few movies that I will still pop in, at least once a year, because it is truly one of the finest pieces of cinema. And I know it's not a perfect representation of Tolkien's source material, but I think it captures, the heart of the story, even though if it's not a, one-for-one representation of it.
But I mean, it's still beautifully made. And I mean,
absolutely.
What's it like 20 years ago now already?
Yeah, it's, almost 20 years old, I think now. Yeah, that will definitely make you feel old.
It's crazy to think how long ago it was made, and if you watch it now, the CGI is still outstanding.
Yeah, well, they did a lot of practical effects as well, right? So Peter Jackson made a big emphasis on practical effects. So the CGI was definitely cutting edge for its time. I mean, the motion capture work that they did for Gollum is like still incredible. I mean, you can kind of tell it's a little bit dated, but not very much. Not very much. So yeah, they were definitely cutting edge in certain areas, but I think the biggest reason it's managed to to age so well is because so much of it is indeed practical effects and things of this nature.
You did mention that you don't watch TV. What's the reason for that?
Yeah, so the creator of the television did not have one in his house, refused to allow his children to watch TV. So I think, when we look back on one of the reasons why we are where we're at as a civilization, as a society, the idiot box, as I like to call it, is certainly one of the major reasons why, it's, I mean, the amount of time that people waste on television every day, as opposed to, again, reading a book or doing something constructive, right? Not even reading, but like a hobby, painting, gardening, so many of the hands-on activities that people, used to pride themselves in, right? I mean, a lot of this has just been replaced by entertainment. And, and that's before we even get into all the agendas that are being pushed through the entertainment, of course. So, yeah, I think just from like a very practical level, and there's been plenty of scientific studies on this that, watching several hours of TV a day reduces your IQ. I mean, it reduces your long-term memory. There are a lot of negative cognitive effects from extended periods of, television watching.
Mm. You have a Substack, and that's how I came across your work. The one that caught my attention, among others, is I think it's a trilogy. It's a three-part series on Sigmund Freud and the impact that he's had on society. And I've always thought that there's something shadowy, there's something dodgy about him.
Yeah, no, certainly. So I write at Substack, dfreality.substack.com. And, you guys can get all my work there. I mean, I'm on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, all the other platforms. I don't do a ton of video content. I have a handful of long form video, lectures essentially, right? Going through, in particular theological issues. So, I write about alternative history, alternative science, parapolitics, which is just a fancy word for conspiracy theories. And the intersection of all three of those with Christianity. So I'm a Christian, and analyzing these topics, and one of the major reasons why I first was interested in exploring these topics was because of my faith and my upbringing. Wanting to really understand the history of Christianity, and kind of how we, how the church arrived at where we're at. So yeah, it's very fascinating, and that's certainly one of the Rosetta Stones for me for analyzing world history and world events, are the scriptures. And it is quite striking when we look at the history detailed, the history of mankind in the scriptures, and, how well that parallels truly with what we've seen play out over the last several thousand years. And, there is a counterfeit gospel, a counterfeit religion in many ways, that I call the mystery religion. And so this is the most ancient religion, besides the true faith in the Creator. And it has always been opposed to, Christianity in its varied forms, right? Not obviously not always under that title, but that's one of the major areas of my focus and my writing. And so, in particular for this subject of Sigmund Freud, it was interesting because the main thrust of this series is around ritual abuse and the modern phenomenon of ritual abuse, in particular occultic or satanic ritual abuse. And so, when we discuss this phenomenon, it's impossible to discuss it without talking about Sigmund Freud, because one of the major reasons why ritual abuse is viewed with such disdain and such scorn, and why many within the profession of psychology just refuse to take this, any of this evidence seriously, despite at this point tens of thousands of survivors across the world over decades and generations now at this point, attesting to the reality of this phenomenon. And so, one of the major reasons why the survivors of ritual abuse are not taken seriously is because of Sigmund Freud's theories, and in particular, the Oedipus complex and his remolding of the seduction theory. And so when we talk about ritual abuse and truly why this is such an epidemic in the West, the Epstein story, again, breaking loose, all sorts of emails confirming, which, if you've been following this story for any, length of time, I've been, following the story and then writing about it professionally now, for several years, but I've been following the story for, over a decade now at this point, right? If you've been following this story, then you know that a lot of the revelations coming out in this recent batch of emails are, none of it's really that new, right? That Jeffrey Epstein was in bed, metaphorically and quite literally with the elite of the world. We're talking, not just entertainment, not just politics, finance, science, academia, Nobel Prize winners, the head of psychology at Harvard. We're talking about very influential people in places and power, in places of power and influence. And so the tentacles and the reach of his network and the blackmail that he had on, I mean, basically the entire Western elite, even not just the West, also Russia, right? Connections to Putin. I mean, he did all sorts of work for Israel, setting up business deals in Mongolia. And, I mean, he had the first lady of the U.S. Virgin Islands on his payroll. I mean, she was an employee of him and helped him facilitate all sorts of, legal activities there. And so, the reality of ritual abuse, and particularly by the elites, right, is something that is not new to the West. This didn't just pop up. Jeffrey Epstein is not an aberration. He is someone in a long line of these kinds of, blackmailers. And there is a deeper spiritual tradition that this all flows from, right? And so that is primarily what interested me in this topic, and what got me down the rabbit hole, as it were, looking at Sigmund Freud and his influence on this realm.
I just want to quickly ask you a question about Epstein. How did he get to where he was?
Yeah. So the reality of Jeffrey Epstein and his blackmail network is that he inherited it from Roy Cohn. So Roy Cohn was, not in the mob per se, but he was a mob lawyer, and he was a member of an organization called the Mega Group, which was a network of very powerful and influential Jewish financiers, bankers, politicians, and they, over the decades, right, collected blackmail, sexual blackmail on all sorts of U.S. politicians, generals, the most powerful individuals in America, including, J. Edgar Hoover was. This is where a lot of the blackmail that was collected on him was at Roy Cohn's parties. And absolutely horrific stuff, right, occurring at these places. And so when Roy Cohn died, that network was picked up rather quickly by Jeffrey Epstein. And so, before he even became a sexual blackmailer, which is honestly, again, the most salacious part of the story, but just one part of the story. Before he ever entered into that blackmail realm, he was a financier, quote unquote, right? People often talked about him as some kind of financial genius or wizard, but I think it's rather dubious. And there's a lot of conflicting stories around this, right? Where on the one hand, he would paint himself kind of as this, this financial wizard, and yet when people, in conversations that they had with him, they just were not very impressed with him. So I think the reality of the situation is that Jeffrey Epstein, the primary focus and the reason, how he got his foot in the door with a lot of the elites, was not the sexual blackmail aspect, but was a financial blackmail aspect. So helping, money laundering or hiding money, in offshore bank accounts. This is one of the primary focuses of Epstein's, criminal enterprise throughout the years. Now, the other big aspect of this is that he was also an arms trafficker and an arms dealer. And, he is connected through his association with Adnan Khashoggi with the Iran-Contra affair. So, you look back on so many of the major scandals throughout American history over the last 40 years, right? Iran-Contra, the savings and loan scandal, Epstein playing a big role in that. There are just so many different scandals that this man was a party to over multiple administrations. How did he get where he is at? Well, it's not through pulling himself up by his bootstraps, right? There was already a network in place, and he was very quickly picked up by this network, right? Whether he was talent scouted, right, or whether he was born into this network, I think is more difficult to say. Both of these things happen, right? As I've argued in other pieces, you don't have a successful multi-generational criminal cartel without being able to talent scout, right? So it's not, everything can't be kept in house, as far as promoting from within, although certainly that is the primary preference. And a lot of this is, intermarrying and things of this sort, but not exclusively.
It's all interconnected, right? So there were two connections there. The one being Epstein being a Jew, and you've got this incredible series on your Substack about you call it the Judeo-Christian paradox,
Yes.
And basically, should a Christian be a Zionist? And ultimately, the answer is no.
Well, I mean, this is a very emotional issue, right? And particularly for Christians in the West. If you're not aware of history, if you're not aware of the history of the church, then you think that this is normal, right? Again, we're living in a very unique time period in church history where for thousands of years, there was no political Jewish entity, right? I mean, since the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and then, again, during the Bar Kokhba revolt and around the 130s AD, there was no Jewish nation, right? There was no Jewish political entity. And so, when someone is trying to tell you that what's going on in the Middle East right now is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and you see something again that hasn't happened in thousands of years, well, it's like, I can't blame some Christians for jumping to some of these conclusions, even though I don't think they're warranted. And so ultimately, right, when we are talking about, Judaism, and this is a major aspect of Freud's story, even though he was irreligious and was an atheist, he was still deeply Jewish in a cultural and philosophical sense, right? And this may seem like a contradiction to people, but once we begin to study Rabbinic Judaism and study Kabbalah, contradiction is inherent within these systems, right? Now, I would argue that's a defeater of the system, but this is a feature of Rabbinic Judaism, that there are all sorts of contradictions that we are to, the royal we, are supposed to marry together. Ultimately, when we are looking at Rabbinic Judaism, people say Judaism, right, and they conflate it with the Old Testament religion, the Hebrew religion. And this could not be further from the truth. So if you just read the Pentateuch, right, the first 5 books of the Bible, this is a temple-based religion, a tabernacle-based religion. So obviously the temple wasn't built during the time of Moses, but all the sacrifices were to be performed in the tabernacle. And then, of course, that shifted to the temple. First Solomon's temple, and then the second temple upon the return to Israel. So there are all sorts of restrictions and qualifications within the law, right, where the location was more important than the time, right? Not just in the land of Israel, but the sacrifices and other things that have to be performed, they have to be performed in a certain physical location. And, again, even the timing was not as important as the location itself, because this is where God dwelled, right? Where his presence was embodied, before the incarnation. And so it is just really puzzling to me, honestly, right? Where how anyone can say that, we are keeping the law, or we are performing the law, or we are a continuation of the Old Testament religion when you don't have a temple. And, again, if you read the prophets, in particular, like Zechariah, there are no sacrifices that are occurring during the Babylonian exile. There are fasts and mourning because the Jews know that we can't perform sacrifices to be, forgiven outside of Israel, outside of the temple, where there is no temple, right? And ultimately, as Paul argues in Hebrews and elsewhere, is that the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, rather, was deficient, and that the blood of bulls and goats never took away people's sins. If fulfilling the law could have brought life, then there would be no need for the sacrifice of Christ on our behalf. And so when there is this conflation, again, between the Old Testament religion, the Hebraic religion, and modern Rabbinic Judaism, I mean, these things cannot be further apart, frankly. And there's a lot of different, you talked about my Judeo-Christian Paradox series. I mean, it's a 5-part series. I go just very in depth going through the Old Testament scriptures and the Talmud. I think probably one of the most salient examples of this, right, is that under the Old Covenant, the Levitical priesthood, the sons of Aaron, are the ones who are to be performing all these religious rites and rituals. And so even if the temple is gone, you don't want to say that they're trying to carry this out in some manner. Well, throughout the Talmud, the rabbis place themselves in positions of power and authority over the Levitical priesthood. So I don't know how much clearer it could be that, the Judaism, as it were, which I always qualify Rabbinic Judaism, is a total usurpation of the Old Testament religion. And that's before we even get into again, just utterly contradictory moral standards and totally subjective moral standards that we find in the Talmud compared to the Old Testament. So, this is a very important subject as it relates to Freud, right? Because even though he would eventually apostatize and would reject the Jewish faith, he was still deeply influenced by the Jewish faith, right? And in many ways, Freud is the quintessential 20th century and modern Jew, where he has rejected his religion. I think it's Alain Papé has this really pithy quote, right, where he says, most modern Zionists, they don't believe in God, but they believe that he promised them the land in Palestine. And, again, this seems like a contradiction, and it is. And yet this is, a very common mindset, right, where even if someone has rejected, the God of
As you and I are recording, there's a huge internet outage.
A few moments later.
This idea, right, that one could reject the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and yet still be Jewish in many ways. This is kind of, the age-old question, right? Like, what is a Jew? Well, it's not just an ethnicity, it's not just a religion, it's also a cultural identity, right? And you could be any one of those three and be considered rightly a Jew. And so Sigmund Freud's, psychoanalysis as a whole, and there's been a lot of scholarly research on this. When he was first promulgating his theories, he tried quite a bit to distance psychoanalysis from, its Jewish roots. It's why he chose Carl Jung really as the face of this movement, as, a Gentile face for psychoanalysis. And yet, since the death of Freud, there's been a tremendous amount of scholarly research on this work. Let me pull up a couple of the books here on this subject, but really the ties between psychoanalysis and psychology and Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. So a couple of good books on this subject. The first being The Hidden Freud, His Hasidic Roots by Dr. Joseph H. Burke. And then the second one, Sigmund Freud and the Jewish Mystical Tradition by Dr. David Bacon. Both of those exceptional works on this subject and really laying out, right, the direct ties and connections between the forms of psychoanalysis and Kabbalistic, philosophy. So in particular, let me just pull up some of these quotes here. So in particular, right, Freud framed all of human experience around sexuality. That all of our issues and, hysterias, mental problems derived from being unable to express those sexual desires and to, unleash that sexual energy, as it were. And so this is, directly cribbed from the writings of the rabbis. And so when we're talking about Kabbalah, I think it's, there are obviously disputations around when these things arose. Now, when we are talking about Kabbalah in the modern era, we're largely referring to the writings of the Zohar and other, medieval mystical texts. Now, of course, those who believe in this system argue that it goes back much further, and that similar to the Talmud, which is the oral law, they claim that these things were all handed down to Moses at Mount Sinai and the 72 elders, and that this has been an oral tradition that has been carried through. So they don't just believe that about the Talmud, they also believe that about Kabbalah, which is Hebrew for instruction. And I think there's a little bit of truth to that, right? That this is a older mystical tradition, not from Moses, of course, right, but from Babylon. And there are, as I cover in the Judeo-Christian Paradox series, there are Jews writing about this in the 2nd and the 3rd century BC, right? Not all Jews follow the Talmud. There are a small portion that do not. They're called Karaites. They are like Torah only. But they are a very small minority, and throughout the last 2,000 years, they've been viciously persecuted by the Talmudists for the most part. So, not all Jews follow the Talmud, but and so there are these Karaite Jews who record some of these charges against the rabbis, right? That they got this philosophy from Plato, and they picked this up in Alexandria, right? And ultimately, I trace, and Plato himself talks about how, he got a lot of his ideas from the mystery schools, and admits that he was a mystery school initiate in Egypt. And so none of this is too controversial, frankly, that there is this much older mystical and ancient tradition, from Babylon to Egypt, and then eventually, through Plato and the Greeks and some of the other, Greek philosophers But the Karaite Jews accuse the rabbis of picking up a lot of their philosophy from these Greek philosophers. So ultimately, I do think that there is an older strain, an older tradition of this. Definitely not from Moses, right? But certainly the more mystical strains of Judaism arise out of the medieval era. And so Kabbalah is first and foremost a philosophy and really a hermeneutic that is applied to the scriptures. And so things are interpreted right in a spiritual light would not be the correct term, but in a much more allegorical sense. And within Kabbalah, in particular, Lurianic Kabbalah, which we know from, eyewitnesses to Freud's, library, certain rabbis that he spoke with, that Freud was very familiar with Kabbalah. He had Kabbalistic texts, rather, in his library. So the man was quite familiar with the teaching, and, in particular, the teachings of Rabbi Luria. And now, according to the rabbi, if this sounds familiar, right? All of human life is centered around releasing this sexual energy. And it's even more significant within this system, right? Because this is how the universe is healed. So ultimately, all of the chaos in creation is a disjunction between the male and feminine aspects of the Godhead. So, again, not all of Judaism would conceive of God as being male and female, but certainly the more mystical segments and Kabbalistics in particular do view God as being male and female in this light. And so, yeah, so many rabbit holes we could go down on that subject in regards to the gender confusion we're being plagued with. But the chaos in creation, right, is because of this disjunction, this dysfunction between these two aspects of the Godhead, as it were. And so the way to heal creation and to ultimately heal the Godhead, right, is by the release of this sexual energy. And so Freud, when he first came across these writings, he said, "This is gold." He was ecstatic, right? Because what he had been working on and a lot of the ideas that he was, expounding in his philosophy of psychoanalysis, this is all stuff that the rabbis had spoken about. And, before we even get into Freud later in life coming across these writings, he grew up in a, Hasidic household. And so the Hasids are a sect of Judaism that is deeply influenced by the Kabbalah and is, it is a mystical, probably the most widespread and popular form of mystical Judaism today. So, Chabad Lubavitch is, they are one of the most powerful political groups, in the world. I don't think that's a stretch, right? And they are, Hasidic Jews.
Sometimes people come to me and say, but why does this matter? And I think it does matter because on a geopolitical level, if we're talking about the Judeo-Christian paradox, look at how it's influencing U.S. foreign policy, number one. Just look at what Netanyahu himself has publicly stated, that they are the chosen people, it's the chosen land. So therefore, the world must stand by Israel.
Certainly. Well, you raise a great point here, is that this is having very direct impacts on our foreign policy. And, for the last over 2 years now at this point, America has been assisting financially, militarily, intelligence-wise in a genocide. This has been recognized as a genocide by the UN, by human rights groups within Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu was wanted, by the ICC for war crimes. So this is very serious, right? Not only for our foreign policy, but also, the image of America on the world, right? Frankly, I think that image has been marred for a while. But nonetheless, when you're going to try and sit here and claim to be some kind of moral arbiter, right? We're the policemen of the world, and yet you're assisting in what is, one of the most horrific genocides. Again, it's a very unique circumstance in that all of this has been documented, live streamed, right? You can go onto Twitter right now and you can see what's going on, and you can see the state, the state of Palestine. It makes the firebombing campaigns and the terror bombing campaigns of World War II. it pales in comparison, frankly, the destruction that's been unleashed upon this this people. And so, but beyond the geopolitical aspect, which is very significant, frankly, from a moral and religious standpoint, right, this impacts the testimony of the church. And this has been one of the major reasons why this issue is so important to me. There is all sorts of evil that can be excused, right? If you think you are literally a different and better class of people than everyone else. And, there is a certain sense in which we can say, right, that, obviously the Bible speaks of the Jews being God's chosen people, but chosen for what, right? That they're elect. Okay, elect for what purpose, though? The purpose was to bring forth the Messiah because of the promises given to Abraham and Isaac and David, right? This is the purpose, and this is why they are special and why they are chosen, because the oracles and prophets of God came to them first, and then to the Gentiles. And so that chosenness, that specialness, is all past tense, right? Christ has come. And so the idea that there is still some ongoing purpose or ongoing function for that specialness, I mean, couldn't be further from the truth. And even the idea in the Old Testament, right, that this is all about, a racial group or an ethnic group, again, could not be further from the truth. And I explore this issue, not just in the Judeo-Christian paradox, but also I have an essay titled, "Should a Christian be a Zionist?" The answer, of course, is an emphatic no. But, I go through this in many of my essays, right, because this is probably the area of the most confusion in the modern church, right, is that the old covenant was all about race. And so, of course, this race under the new covenant should still have some kind of some preference given to them. I mean, throughout the old covenant, we see time and time again, Gentiles added in, being grafted in to the covenant of Israel. So whether it is during the Exodus, right, there is a mixed multitude. There's all sorts of Egyptians that leave Egypt with the Hebrews and join Israel. Jacob is an Edomite. I mean, within the lineage of Christ, he has multiple Gentiles. So Rahab, the Canaanite harlot, she is in the lineage of Christ. Also Christ is descended from the Moabites, through Ruth. So these are two of the ancient enemies of God. And yet, within the lineage of the Messiah, we see faithful Gentiles who have rejected, their pagan ways, and who have come to worship the true God, right? So even under the old covenant, this idea that, it's only for the children of Abraham, and this is the only way you can have access to these promises and these blessings. I mean, did all the children of Abraham, right, when they left the Exodus, did all the Hebrews make it to the promised land? No, right? So, I mean, this isn't even true during that time period that they had access to all these promises. There are two chapters in particular that I think really highlight this issue, Ezekiel chapter 18 and Jeremiah chapter 18. And both of them talk about, the blessings and the promises of God, and how when God promises something good to a people, so Ezekiel is about, individuals, and Jeremiah is about the nation as a whole. And so if a people, a person, right, or a nation, if destruction, if judgment has been prophesied over them and they repent, as we see in Jonah chapter 3, then God will relent, right? He will repent of the destruction that he had planned for them. Similarly, if God has promised good things over a people and they apostatize and they reject him, then he is under no obligation whatsoever to fulfill those good promises to him. And so this is just utterly crystallized under the new covenant, where Paul says in Ephesians chapter 1 that all the blessings of God are in Jesus Christ. Yea and amen. So the idea that we could somehow, that there's a people of God who are going to receive spiritual blessings outside of being in covenant with Christ is just a totally bizarre notion, frankly. I don't understand it. How someone could read the New Testament and the Old Testament and come to some of these conclusions, unless someone has been telling you, hey, this is what it means. And so now you just read the text and you're like, oh, this is what it means. But you've not actually thought through this issue yourself. So, yeah, the idea that, the Jewish people as a race, as an ethnicity, have some kind of special rights that no one else does. Again, not true under the Old Testament. If anything, this blessing that's been given to them is is not to their benefit, right? Because they have been judged very harshly for receiving this knowledge and yet still rejecting it. Paul, when he's preaching on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17, he says in times past that God winked at, he kind of ignored the, not totally, right? But he made exceptions. And he understood that the pagans did not have a full knowledge of the truth here. And so now that Christ has come, however, all men everywhere are required to repent. And again, Galatians, perhaps, the epistle that really just crystallizes as Galatians chapter 3, where Paul exegeting the promises of both Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 15, right? So Genesis chapter 12, very famously, where God says, those who bless you, right? Singular, Abraham, the man, will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed. This is not talking about all of ethnic Israel. And even more importantly, Paul exegetes that seed, right? The promised seed that will come and bless the nations, not as an entire ethnic group, but as a singular person, right? That seed is Jesus Christ. And this is a theme that we see throughout the Pentateuch. I had an Old Testament scholar on my program, Dr. Kevin Chen, and he has a book all about the Messianic vision of the Pentateuch. I highly recommend readers or the listeners, check that out, because he goes through in detail all the Messianic prophecies and this theme of the promised seed that is to come, right? That we first see in Genesis chapter 3. But Genesis chapter 15 is where the land is promised to Abraham. And now Paul says that all the faithful Gentiles, right, who have faith in God, that we are the children of Abraham, that we have been adopted in, right? We're not, literally the children of Abraham by blood, but we have been adopted into the family. And that is what truly counts, right? Not this ethnic bloodline, as Paul says in Romans, not all of those who are Israel are of Israel. Excuse me, I had that in a verse. Not all of those who are of Israel, right? The ethnic Israel are Israel, the true Israel, the followers of God. So, yeah, I know, kind of a long-winded answer there.
I think the last time I heard Mars Hill was back in the days of Rob Bell. Do you remember him?
Yes.
Man, what happened to him?
He went off the deep end. Yeah, I mean, I'm not even sure he's a Christian anymore, But
no, I don't think he is. No.
Yeah, no.
He was all the rage, I think, in the early 2000s.
Yeah, no, I remember.
And then he got involved with.
I was gonna say,
and then he was on Oprah. And, yeah.
No, I remember my church running videos of him. Yep.
Showing your age, if you remember Oprah, the Angel Network. So I pulled you off track. I apologize. You were actually talking about Freud, but interestingly enough, it's all connected.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this is one of the very, and I probably would not have made some of these connections if not for, the other research that I've done first on, the occult and on Kabbalah. And so, when I started, compiling resources for this and going through, some of these works on Sigmund Freud, and certainly within the last 40 years, this work has really died down. But, there's a time period in the 70s there where there's a lot, 70s and 80s, where there's a lot of criticism being leveled against Freud. Yeah, I don't know. I have my suppositions, on why some of these criticisms died out. And, still we largely have adopted so much of Freud's, methodology in the modern era. But this is again, just a fascinating subject, right? Because we really cannot overemphasize here the impact that Sigmund Freud has had on the modern world. The role of psychology and the role that has played, within relationships, raising of children, a family, schooling, right? I mean, some of the most intimate aspects of human relations, obviously sex, right? A huge portion of Freud's work revolves around this. And so when we're talking about Sigmund Freud, we're really talking about one of the seminal figures of the 19th and 20th century. And, when we look back truly, at the last 200, 300 years, and we ask ourselves, how did we get, collectively as the West, how did we get here, right? Well, Sigmund Freud is certainly, he is, on the Mount Rushmore of how we got where we got. The role and the influence that he has had, not just on the realm of psychology, but how psychology has impacted and has influenced so many other realms, right? Obviously schooling in a major, major way. And the role that sexuality, in particular childhood sexuality, right? This has had a massive impact on society, a massive impact. I mean, the idea that children could be able to choose their own gender, this is, again, straight out of a derivative of Freud's writings. So he was not willing to take it the next step. He was not willing to take his ideas to their logical conclusion. And that is, if all of our dysfunctions center around sex, and so our dysfunctions are caused by not being able to express these sexual desires, no matter what they are, then, within this system, the logical conclusion to that then is that, okay, well, if we need to express these sexual desires, then that should be, then that's a good thing, right? Because obviously mental diseases and hysteria, these are bad things. And so to prevent that, we need to do, the opposite. And that's what, again, you wonder why. The West does not even know what a man or a woman is anymore. The idea that we would even allow children to make these kinds of decisions. It is a result of this, and Freud's, his acolytes, so more so in part two, I get into Wilhelm Reich and how, he, again, was a Marxist and is constantly attacking the family, right? And not just the family as a whole, but fathers in particular. And that fathers were the perpetuators of tyranny and authoritarianism. And that, by keeping the children down, that was inculcating this acceptance of tyranny within, the populace or what have you. But yeah, it is just the impact, right? And the after effects of Freud's ideology really just, cannot emphasize this enough how big of a role this man has played over the last 100 years or so.
Well, he's like the foundation of modern psychology. And
Yes.
if you think about it, the average psychologist generally doesn't favor keeping your family together. If you go to see a psychologist with relationship issues, it will almost always end in, we'll focus on you. It's about you. How do you feel? And get rid of the toxicity. Find your new self. It's not about the family unit. It's about you.
Yeah, and this is just one of the larger symptoms, right, of the West and the atomization of individuals, and really the severing of familial and communal ties, right? Because ultimately it all starts with the family. And Freemasonry and Masonic revolutions is another major aspect of my work. And so this is one of the things that I've noted throughout Masonic revolutions over the last 300 years is that without fail, the family is always going to be attacked. Sometime sooner rather than later. One of the first laws that was passed in France after the French Revolution was no-fault divorce. And, similarly in the Mexican Revolution, it took, a couple decades to get there, but they also legalized no-fault divorce. So, similarly in the Soviet Union, the destruction of the family, the institution of no-fault divorce, right? This had catastrophic effects on society. And truly one of the major reasons why, seemingly the West cannot stave off what is happening to it, right? Why we can't, effectualize and organize any kind of resistance is that, well, all the ties of community have been severed, right? And the most important one is family. The broken families. This is how wealth was passed on, right? This is how, you look at the decrepit state of most middle-class families in America. It's because of divorce, right? Because in the past, your family inheritance was not being basically paid off to lawyers, which is frequently happening. These divorce cases are not, they're not cheap. They're not cheap. And so that nest egg that, over time would have developed into, hundreds of thousands of dollars, what have you, that tens of thousands of dollars, that's wiped out. So there's all sorts of downstream effects of the destruction of the family, beyond the impact that, fatherlessness has on children. And of course, the explosion of, sexual dysfunction in the West, anxiety, depression. I mean, there have been numerous studies on this, and, not just by, like a bunch of Christian zealots, but by the government, and all sorts of secular institutions who have no religious agenda whatsoever. The consequences have been catastrophic, right? So, without fail, you look at the data, and children from married households, with their biological mother and father, ideally, but married households in general, they are less prone to all sorts of mental diseases, again, in direct contradiction of Freud and, Reich and so many of, Freud's acolytes. They are less likely to get, involved in crime, drugs, all sorts of other, a host of other dangerous, risky activities, right? So, yeah, the reality is that fatherhood is the single best determinant factor of, having a father in the household, the single most determinant factor for the success of a child. And, obviously I'm aware that not all fathers are good, and there's plenty of bad fathers out here. And we're not talking about the exceptions, right? We're talking about the rule, right? What should be the norm. We don't structure public policy around the exceptions. We structure it around, the norm. And so the norm is, and the ideal, not just in the scriptures, but validated scientifically over and over and over again over the last 100 years since the beginning of the sexual revolution, is that, fathers are indispensable. We cannot just remove or get rid of fathers. And ultimately, that authority figure, right, is going to be replaced by someone. Humans are inherently hierarchical. And if it's not going to be your father, right, and this is what ultimately happened, is that the state is replaced, right? The state is the one who determines your morality. The state is the one who determines, what is acceptable or not. The state is the one who determines, everything about your life. That is the ultimate arbiter and determiner. And so, if we want to talk about staving off authoritarianism, which, is not hierarchy in its proper sense, right, but an abuse of hierarchy and abuse of power, then, there's no better way than to remove the father, honestly, right? So I question, how much of this is, they're just self-delusion that they think these things will actually come to pass, and how much of it is, oh no, we're very aware the importance of the fathers, and we want to become, that single authority figure in the lives of, most people.
And then in your work, you then talk about Alfred Kinsey, is it? And how he followed on from Reich and Freud, and was influenced by Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, it's, as we get into, that's going to be the focus of the next piece, right, is the OTO and Crowley. Honestly, not a surprise that Kinsey would be so fascinated with Crowley, since he's one of the most prolific, sexual occultists in all of human history. He wrote the man wrote like hundreds of books, just extremely prolific writer. And a massive amount of those works center around what is called sex magic, right, with a K. And that, this is what, the occultists believe, right? I think a lot of this stuff is hooey, but, whether I believe it or not, whether it has any reality or not, this is what they believe, and it informs their worldview. And so, for Crowley, the most, and, he gets a lot of this from the Kabbalah, the most transgressive acts are the ones that stir up the most amount of spiritual energy, as it were, right? And so for him, the most transgressive sexual act is male sodomy. And so that plays a major role in his work. And so it's not surprising at all, frankly, that Kinsey, who himself was a closeted homosexual, would be so fascinated with Crowley's work. Of course, I believe it's Judith Reisman. She's written several books on Kinsey's work, but Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences, she posits, and I think it's, we don't have any smoking gun evidence of it, but I think it's very likely that Aleister Crowley was one of Kinsey's unnamed informants, as you were, right? So Kinsey is certainly a very important figure in this discussion, this subject, right, of the sexual revolution and sexual politics, because Uh, again, less than 100 years ago, most of what we're discussing now, most of what you see performed, like not even online, but in the streets of America now, I mean, these things were illegal, right? I mean, you would have gone to jail if you'd have done some of this stuff. And so, yeah, the laws in America forbid, and most of the West, frankly, right, forbid this kind of behavior and this kind of activity. And it's only through the work of Kinsey that so many of these laws were changed. So through his research, which, not just Judith Reisman, but plenty of people have demonstrated now at this point that Kinsey falsified and fabricated all sorts of his research. I mean, it is one of the principles of, the scientific theory is repeatability. If I can't reproduce a test, then it's not actually science, right? I haven't come to any conclusion. At best, it's a supposition. At best, right? Without being able to reproduce the same exact results, to remove specific variables, to introduce variables, right? I mean, you actually don't have a scientific theory, This is pseudoscience. And this is a very well-known problem within, the social sciences and this literature in general, is the reproducibility problem, is that, there are so many major sociological studies where once these studies are run again, totally different results are achieved. Right. So, yeah, I know a lot of Skinner's experiments fall into this camp. But so Kinsey absolutely doctored a bunch of his work, as we know now. A significant chunk of his data set he pulled from prisons. So people who were in jail for sex crimes, prostitutes, homosexuals, pedophiles. The absolute dregs of humanity. And this was a very, very significant chunk of his data set, like upwards of 25% of the male data set. So this is very significant and is obviously going to throw off your statistics in a major way. When we can just look at a polling of, men in America, 25% of men have not been convicted for sex crimes, right? So the idea that this is an honest representation of the American population is just an absolute myth. And so this is why Kinsey was able to present this data and make it seem that America's sexuality laws were antiquated, right? That, the reality is that, according to Kinsey's statistics, 80% of American males were sex offenders, according to the current laws. So that means we had to change all these things, right? And not only loosen these things, but also, of course, is that, these sexual desires are good, they're healthy things. They're totally normal. Any kind of natural desire you have is normal. It's like, okay, people have the desire to murder, right? That's a natural desire that people have. Does that mean people should go be satiating that? I don't think anyone would be arguing that. But when it comes to these other natural desires that we have, which, the desires, and particularly the sexual desire, right? These are good things, and these were given to us by the Lord. Before Adam and Eve ever fell, the Lord told, them to be fruitful and to multiply. So, when these things are in their proper place, then they are good things. But when any of our desires, whether it's, lust or, sexual desire, right, or whether it's hunger or, sloth, right, any of these things, when taken to extremes, become bad things, that we want to eat, that we need to eat, that's not a bad thing. But if you're sitting at home all day eating bonbons, right, never getting up from the couch, well, that is a bad thing. That is a very bad thing. So these desires are good things. And this is ultimately, one of the most damaging aspects of this entire movement is that there is an overreaction or correction, against this mindset. Well, it's like, we have these laws around sexuality, and so we just need to go to the other extreme. Well, these laws, whatever you think about them, they were placed there for a reason. And frankly, were pretty consistent over the last 2,000 years of Western history. Obviously there are exceptions, but for the most part, right, the idea that you could just break up your family on an emotional whim and totally sever these bonds is just, utterly alien, particularly to Christianity, and the importance and the focus that Christ puts upon marriage, and he cites the importance of marriage. He goes back to Genesis chapter 3, right? And he uses Adam and Eve as the example. Moses allowed divorce because of the hardness of people's hearts, because they could not forgive. And for both parties, right? Not just the male. And so this is why there are a exception has been made within the law for divorce, right? But this is not, as Jesus says, not how it was always, right? It was not always like this. And he again goes back to Genesis and cites the example of Adam and Eve, that this is the model for family. This is the model for marriage. One man, one wife, right? In perpetuity. What God has joined, let no man tear asunder. And so this is, from the very beginning of creation, this is the model for human civilization and human society. And so the attack on this, it's one of the things that, I did not realize I'd be focusing on this issue so much, in this series, but just kind of naturally arose, right? Is that, so many of these people, the adherents of Freud and, his intellectual progeny, so many of them have attacked the family and have undermined this institution. Certainly looking back, at the history of Masonic revolts, and, of course, Freud himself was a member of B'nai B'rith. I don't think that's, a coincidence, frankly.
And didn't Kinsey also make allowances, quote unquote, scientifically for pedophilia? Yes.
So Kinsey worked with dozens of pedophiles, and there is an infamous table in Kinsey's book on male sexuality, where
Table 34.
Table 34, where there are children, from infancy to teenage years, and there is a timetable of how many times they orgasm within a certain amount of time. These are, again, documented crimes, right? Documented crimes. It's frankly insane that, and it just goes to show you the power of the media and the power of mass manipulation and mass control, right? Of course, Edward Bernays is the father of modern propaganda, the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And so it just goes to show you the power of the media and the influence that it can have on our thinking, because, this was all in the book, right? In 1945, I believe, or 48 when it came out. And this is all in the book, and these are documented crimes. And yet it's like, oh, wow, this is the most amazing man. He's, just a scientific genius. We need to move to the future. This is all fuddy-duddy, ancient morality. We need to evolve and move past this kind of stuff. It's just utterly shocking, right? And so, he worked with dozens of pedophiles to conduct experiments, quote unquote, actually crimes against children. And this is the basis upon which childhood sexuality and so much of the study of childhood sexuality has been based upon these aberrant doctrines and philosophies. And, you read some of the retellings and the recountings of these quote unquote orgasms. And what it sounds like is not any kind of sexual pleasure, but it sounds like children in extreme distress, right? That's what it sounds like. And the idea that children are inherently sexual beings, this all stems from Kinsey's work. And so this is why it's been so important, before you even get into the topic of ritual abuse, how is it possible that thousands of children could come forward, right, with tales of horrific sexual abuse and crime, and most authorities and people within the psychological realm will tell them, you are imagining this. This is actually a fantasy that you have, right? This is something that you want to do, and it's like basically a case of projection, essentially. Where does that all come from? It comes from Freud. It comes from Kinsey. And so, when we look at the phenomenon of ritual abuse and why this topic has been so maligned, it is beginning to be more talked about, in a serious tone. I think the Epstein saga has certainly played a large part in unveiling and revealing truly the depravity of the elites, right? But Epstein's not new. Again, this is something that's been going on amongst elite circles for, frankly, thousands of years.
It's difficult to ignore the fact that Epstein was a Jew and so was Freud.
Yeah, no, and obviously, I'm not trying to blame, all Jews for these things monolithically, but the idea that, Kabbalism or some of these other Jewish philosophies did not have an impact or an influence upon these belief systems, I mean, that's just demonstrably untrue, right? So it's significant to note, right, because, again, in my conception, Judaism is a heresy. That is rabbinic Judaism. It's a departure from the true faith, right, of Abraham, of Isaac, of Moses. And so when we have heresies of any sort, well, eventually they're going to evolve into this state. And so it is, I think, essential to note the role that Judaism has had, and particularly, rabbinic Judaism and Kabbalistic mystical Judaism has had on the modern world. And truly, as I argued in part one of this series, is that in many ways, psychoanalysis is the Judaizing of the Western psyche. We have replaced the confessional table with the psychiatrist chair, or the confessional table, the confessional booth, excuse me, with the psychiatrist chair, And so there is really a false religiosity that is being propped up here. And when we, look at what has happened to the West, I think, honestly, all of this stems from, Solzhenitsyn said that, ultimately all of this happened, and he's speaking of the Russian Revolution, because men forgot God. I think that's why we're here, in the West, is that we have forgotten God. We have forgotten Christ. And so the further and further we depart from Christ, the darker and darker the West will become. And so ultimately all of the good things that, secular humanists love about the West, these are Christian ideas and Christian notions. The idea that all men are created equal, right? You don't observe that in nature, right? I mean, what we observe actually is that all men are not created equal, right? Some men are born with, greater talents than others. But that is the idea that we're all equal is a Christian notion, right? That we're all equal before God. You don't get to look out into the world, right? And see these kinds of things. The idea, life, liberty, originally the pursuit of property. Why are these good things? Why should anyone adhere to these things? Why ought we follow these moral prescriptions when we have totally removed any foundation for basing those morals, right? There's no justification for so many of these morality claims that are made in the modern world. They've essentially just hijacked Christian morality, and they want to keep all the good things, and they don't want to keep any of the things they disagree with, which is largely just, telling people to repent of their sin and their evil, right? We like the good aspects of Christianity, that we love everyone, but we're going to totally redefine what love means. Well, at this point, right, it's just preferences. There's, the secular has their secular humanists, they have their preferences. Well, us religious folk, right, us Christians, we have our preferences. At this point, the idea that you can say Christianity is wrong or Christian morality is wrong, I mean, well, that's just your preference,
How can my audience follow your work?
Yeah, no, man. First of all, just thanks for having me. Great conversation, and we went down so many different rabbit holes. There's so much we didn't get to. Yeah, for those who appreciated what you heard, if you want to go check out more of my work, support my work, you can go over to dfreality.substack.com. That's Dispatches from Reality. And if you just type in Scipio Eruditus or Dispatches from Reality, in your search bar or whatever, what have you, you'll be able to find me. Again, we primarily, all my essays are on Substack, and again, I have some video lectures and other things. All my content you can find at Substack, but we're on other platforms as well. And so, I just appreciate, again, the time and being able to discuss these very important issues with you. And I think, as we discussed earlier, right, this is not just, these ideas don't just have an impact on our politics. These ideas have an impact on, every aspect of human life, the way that, men and women, husband and wife, father, child, parent and child, right? The way that we interact and function as a society has been deeply impacted by these philosophies, and so it is just, if you don't know where you came from, then, you're never going to know where you're eventually going.
Scipio Eruditus, I know that that's not your real name. Thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Yeah, appreciate it, Jerm.